a mouthful. It's an Irish name. This project was done with my supervisors, Dr. Vaughan and Dr. Charlie Cullen as well. So the main idea is looking at the affordances we can have with VR environments to see how it can promote Irish language identity. So just a little bit of background on that. I'm from Ireland myself, and in Ireland, the Irish language is a minority language, so only a very small percentage of Irish people can speak fluently in Irish. And I come from one of those regions where people speak fluently, which is known as the Gaeltacht regions, where everyone converses in Irish. So what the interesting question here is, in Ireland, even though our Irish is spoken by only 2% of the population, overall, the primary language of Ireland and the officially recognised first language of Ireland is Irish. So it leads to quite an interesting linguistic situation going on. So what we were interested in doing is see how VR can kind of augment the learning of this situation, particularly looking at communities practice and looking at this idea of, by being able to contextually put people in an environment where they're seeing Irish constantly, does this change their motivation particularly and how they view their identity? So I'm just going to try get the slide here. Sorry, I'm trying to just move the next slide on. Is it here? Seems locked on me here. There we go. Yeah, perfect. So basically, I'm just going to go give a quick overview of how the VR environment worked itself, and then just talk about some of the outcomes we had. So the VR environment was built within Unity, and our main reason for using Unity with this was because we were able to bring in a lot of store-bought assets and get a lot of the items in the shop working very quickly without having to use a lot of 3D modeling, but still give it a kind of realistic feel. So what happened was a shopper would go through this environment and they'd be able to pick up any of the items around the shop. And there was over 160 items. And when you pick up any item, it would say the word in Irish and give text over it in Irish. So the idea was that this first character you can see, and there's a range of different characters in the different levels in the shop, would give the player a task of finding a few different items in the shop. The player would then go around and pick up these items and put them in their bag. And then once they got all their tasks, they proceeded to the next level. So in terms of research instruments and what we were actually examining, the main research instrument is known as the Dornai L2 Self-System Questionnaire. So that's interested in situated learning, and it's fairly interested in motivation. Language learning motivation as kind of built in by a range of factors, but the primary one it's interested in is this idea of the L2 self. So the ideal L2 self is that image of yourself as seeing yourself as a future speaker. So having an idealized version of you who could engage in this task. We also measured vocabulary retention, increased by 20% after engaging with the environment. Irish language anxiety also decreased afterwards, and their linguistic self-confidence increased. And all these measures, as I was saying already in this questionnaire, kind of work together and tangentially move together to kind of give an overall picture rather than trying to pick one measure and talking about that by itself. We also used some presence questionnaires to see how people got on, and this test was done 3 times with participants over the course of 5 weeks. And we found as they went through the experience repeatedly, the presence questionnaire actually raised each time, which was an interesting finding to us, that we found when people got used to actually using their VR headset and navigating around the environment and got more comfortable with the environment itself, it improved how immersed they felt within the environment itself. So we felt the actual design of the environment had a huge impact in how VR was used. And yeah, that's the kind of main details of the flash talk. So thanks everybody for this section.
Great, wonderful. So with that, we are going to be going on to the next of the presentations. So this is going to be a collaborative immersive language learning environment using augmented panoramic imagery.
Hello, everyone. I'm Samuel Chabot. I'm a PhD student at Rensselaer in the Cognitive and Immersive Systems Lab. Some of my co-authors, we've got Jaimie Drozdal, a research assistant, Matthew Peveler, another PhD student. Zhou was the professor of Chinese we've worked with. Hui Su is the director of our lab, and Jonas Braasch is my advisor. I'm going to skip ahead on the next slide. Great. So we know that one of the best ways to learn a foreign language is to immerse yourself in it. And we also know that language is a social process, but traveling to another country to immerse yourself in it isn't always possible, especially today. So we're asking if we can let groups of users go on virtual trips together. Can we recreate some of these experiences and bring the country to the student? And can we measure that and to see if the experience is useful? So in our environment that you can see here in the slide, we've been using these real-world imagery that we've started to augment with language learning tasks. Some of these tasks are learning vocabulary words or the things that you see, using some flashcards and some quizzes, practicing dialogue at related portions that you might like be asked by a vendor, a question prompted, and then the student would respond back. You interact using speech and gesture, like you can see here the student is doing. And all of this is happening while you're still in person with your classmates in the room. So last summer, we used the project in a course at RPI called AI-Assisted Immersive Chinese. The class split its time between a traditional classroom setting and our environment. And we modeled the content on a study abroad trip to Shanghai. So every week they looked at a new theme like travel and shopping. At the end of the experience, we gave the students a questionnaire for things like usability and engagement, and almost all of the responses said that they thought the space could improve their language skills and that they thought they interacted more with their classmates. But we wanted to isolate the effects of the room, so this spring we did a controlled follow-up. We ran a mini course to teach about shopping and negotiating in Chinese markets. This time, all of the learning happened in the space, and we had the students take tests before and after to measure for changes. In the end, we found that scores did significantly improve between pre and post tests. And one of the questions from the previous session was if we see retention of this material over time. So we did a 3-week delay post test, and we did see that there wasn't a significant decline in the information. Another important factor that has been talked about in some of the other talks this week is student comfort. And in both studies, the students told us that they were both more comfortable and less anxious practicing in the space than they would be with an actual person. Now, originally, our plan was to host another one of these courses this summer to test out more of these variables. But with the students away from campus, we've started to adapt some of this stuff for an online platform so the students can still use it while they're home and we can still get some of their feedback. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks.
Great. So I think before we go, thank you. Before we go ahead and get to any questions, I just want to say that we should probably give them a quick round of applause even now. So an F4, and if you are on a Mac and you want to do it the other way, if you do /cheer. Great, thank you for that. So as far as questions, is there any that you want to have answered at this time? Please post them in the chat. So far it's been, thanks everyone, looks amazing, taking many notes. If not, I do have some prepared questions. Okay, so we have our first question, which comes from Rob, and I think we'll go to both speakers in order of how you presented. So first is this application available publicly?
Hi, yeah, I'll share a link in a bit. It's on my itch.io page, so I'll be able to put a link up and you'll be able to try it publicly from there. It's just needs it's built with SteamViewer, so it works with any VR headset as well.
And our platform isn't yet available publicly, but we are working on building that online platform, so we'll be able to share that as a public website that anybody can come and use.
Great, thank you both for that. And I know for the second session, it was the next steps were to try to have a device agnostic system as well. So thank you. And so the next question that we have in order is from Susanna. And this is for our first presenter. It's, what model did you use for measuring language anxiety?
Yeah, so language anxiety was measured on that same Journal IL2 self-system questionnaire. So it's one of the scales within the questionnaire itself. So I'd really recommend the questionnaire. Actually, it comes from kind of a collection of other ones, like a lot of the work by Robert Gardner and other language questionnaires have kind of been mixed in with it.
Okay, great. So moving right along, our next question comes from Roger Taylor, and it is probably for both presenters. So do you know the effect sizes for the results for your respective studies?
Yeah, we were just checking this right now. I'm trying to think if I have them offhand. We used find it here. It was quite low now overall, and the reason for this is because, like I was saying during this talk, overall we only had 10 participants, and it was actually quite difficult in getting our participants because it was a repeated interaction trial, and we had a lot of talk about that at the time when we were building the study. And the reason being is that this is built off a design-based research metric. So there was 2 case studies before this one where we tried this interaction before, and something we found particularly with virtual environments is if people weren't getting repeated interaction and getting very comfortable with how the whole world worked and how the environment worked, it was very hard to measure if their motivation was changing once. And then, but because we used a longer period of time to gain participants, we needed participants themselves for a longer period of time to kind of stay in touch with us. So there was kind of an interesting question and debate always having here between the effect size we were able to garner and the number of participants mixed in with how true the reactions and how true the responses we were going to get by not getting them longer. So I suppose that's kind of a lot of the debate you have about this thing.
Yep, and to follow that up on some of our results, the students were scored out of 75 points for our pre-test and post-test. There was sort of a mix of the content that they were exposed to across the mini course that they took. And before the course was taken, I believe there was an average of about 39 out of 75 of the questions was the average on the pre-tests. And after the course, the scores were about 59 or 60 out of 75 of those questions that they were able to answer. And the course consisted of, it was 4 one-hour learning sessions that they would come in for over the 2 weeks.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and also go to the next question. So this comes from Janae Robert, and she asks, as far as the presenters, if you're aware of any other kind of language learning platforms like a Rosetta Stone for VR. And so far, actually, the other participants here have been able to say about Monly and Immerse Me. Another one, which I'll put in the chat, is more 360 video focused, but it's Wanda VR. So I know that Harvard has the French La Republique. And so for presenters, are you aware of anything else to add?
I think those are.
Go ahead.
Let Samuel speak.
I was just going to add, or I would have said Monly and Immerse Me. Those are the 2 that we've looked at. Monly is interesting because of their the AI agents that you speak with, and that's part of the experience that we're looking to create in our space, is that you talk to instead of having to speak only with your peers who are also learning along with you, you can speak to an AI agent that knows the language a bit better than you as the learner do.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to that as well. Like, a lot of the work we were interested in is in contextual learning and how it happens with language as well. So some of the things I found quite interesting myself is it's a bit older now, but there was a project done to test AI there. I'm trying to think of which group did it. It was IBM have a VR environment where you can say any word, and it's just for English at the moment, but basically you say any word and it'll appear in your hand of whatever that object is, and it was to test out machine learning with their AI thing. So while it's not specifically tailored towards a full language learning suite or platform, it's quite interesting to kind of get that kind of constructivist knowledge from it, being able to build out the environment, kind of build the learning in it. And another one that's quite useful is, and again, it's an older one, but Google Expeditions, and a lot Google did with Cardboard in the earlier days, and how they actually built their learning environments themselves are actually quite interesting. And again, in that way, it's quite discovery-based learning, and while it's not tailored with a specific objective in mind, going around a lot of these environments and just having a facilitator in charge to talk about what they're seeing and try and give words to the actions they're seeing. It's quite interesting, some of those applications as well.
Okay, great. So I know a little bit down is the link for the streaming. I'm gonna be talking to the tech support in the background to see if there is another video that we could go for the streaming of the session. So in the meantime, while we are trying to get an answer, our next question is going back to Susanna. Are you planning to localize your environment for other languages?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of discussion and conversation around this. Like specifically at the moment, this research is being done for my own PhD, which is specifically targeted with Irish language in mind. But yeah, like the environment itself and how it works, it's very accessible, and it was built in a way where it's very easy to just change and swap around the vocabulary in the language that's being used. Now, what we're interested in specifically in this is examining specific language groups and trying to be very specific about the different motivations of language groups. Like as I introduced in the start, and I was talking a little bit about the specific context of Irish, one thing I'm interested in is like the sociolinguistic nature of different languages and how much this variation in the context that the language comes from can actually change the motivation of learners. So just to give you an example, English is quite a modern and globalized language where people have a lot of reason to use it in their daily life for commerce reasons or economical reasons. Something like Irish doesn't have that same need because everyone in Ireland already speaks English. So you're actually trying to create needs and create tasks and create reasons to use a language that doesn't have a commercial need anymore. So I personally would be very interested in looking at other minority languages with a tool set like this. But the tool set, the environment itself could be used with any language at all, and you could change around the words that way.
Yeah, actually, I'll follow up on that as well. We, originally our environment was for learners of Chinese, and originally Chinese was picked because it's such a difficult language to learn, being a tonal language for non-tonal language speakers. And so our goal was sort of to look at reducing the number of hours it would take to learn such a language or learn more content within that same amount of time. But we demonstrated our project to some other language learning professors to get some of their feedback, and yeah, immediately they were asking us if we could develop this for other languages. And so we've started to, our system is a bit modular, and so we started to put in pieces that allow us to switch it to other languages. So we've got a proof of concept also running in German, and we've started to work with, earlier last semester, we were working with a professor of Russian to look at what content for a Russian module would be like. So yeah, as we go forward, the goal is to maintain this as a modular system that would allow like swapping in and out of other languages.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So kind of circling back, the other item that I said about French, I just posted in with multitasking in the chat. So our next question is actually two, coming from Lillian. And that is great presentations. I actually have two questions, so we'll do this one at a time. What do you think is unique about immersive language environment when you compare it to immersive environment in general? And then I'll do the follow-up later on.
Well, one of the things that's unique about the environment is that you can make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes, and students know that when they come in, that there isn't going to be a negative consequence if they don't know the answer. If they go to a shop and they don't know how to ask, can I order one of these? And also that the system can then provide feedback. So the system can help the students when they are struggling, when there is an issue, or if there is something that they don't know. So the learning within the actual context, but also the availability of correcting or teachable moments in the space.
I think that's a great question, and it actually, I was watching the talk just before this one as well, and people were talking a lot about how do you take notes in VR and how do you do a lot of worksheets, and interestingly, just brings the same thing. I think what's so interesting about VR environments is that we don't need a lot of the same traditional teaching methods because it's meant to be about hands-on learning where you're actually experiencing things. So I think it's really interesting in the case of language learning that it really changes a lot of the paradigm of what we're looking at. Like specifically when I talk about how I'm looking at identity and the situated nature of language, we're suddenly able to engage in a lot more instances of learning and really dive into people and how they interact and how they specifically feel about things like anxiety, as I was saying in this. And I think it kind of always roots back to the task-based nature that we get involved with VR that we don't really have the same access to in the classroom. We can suddenly kind of engage people in a task, and then when they're in that task, we can see all the range of different responses they can have from that. And I think that follows in with what Sam was saying there as well, in that you can repeat this task in a safe zone and in a safe environment. And I think that's a huge part of the challenge with language learning is learners need practice, but there's a huge amount of a social anxiety as well as your average learning anxiety you have with any other task. But with language, that's amplified quite substantially because the social side of trying to engage in doing something. And I think VR, that's where it really shines out, is we can kind of limit that level of anxiety from happening.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and say the second follow-up question. If there's nothing to add, that's fine. But I think you touched on this a little bit. But do you think immersive environment is different from the authentic language environment? What are the advantages of the virtual one?
So yeah, I think a little bit of that was in the last. I think, yeah, they are very different. Like for one thing, I'd just like to highlight that as great as an virtual environment is, and as much as we were able to draw from what we were doing, it's still not completely authentic. And that's a good thing and a bad thing. So like in terms of the advantages of that, when we talk about things like anxiety, you're actually able to get learners to try out language that they mightn't try out if they were in that Irish language environment and actually interacting with someone who's authentic and real to the language. But then contrary to that, what we found really interesting, we'd like to go further with this research at some point, is to actually see how learners engage afterwards in a real environment. So it's something not, I can't think of any study, and we examined it at the time, while pre-test and post-test and learners commenting on their own anxiety levels afterwards is interesting. It's a little bit biased based on learners talking about how anxious they felt in a game as opposed to how anxious they'd really feel with a speaker. And I think the only way to really gauge this stuff in the future is to start getting learners to engage in these interactions afterwards and starting to measure how these interactions change based off people interacting in virtual environments compared to real environments. But I think that actually goes across a lot of virtual work and a lot of the work being done in here, and we are quite limited by, you know, scale and the need for questionnaires and these kind of metrics.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mentioned, you know, measuring for retention after, but not only just retention, but then seeing how they actually apply that knowledge in what would be the authentic context. And I totally agree with what you were saying about it is different than an authentic context. It's not the exact same, and there are pros and cons of that. And a lot of the pros are sort of the ones we were talking about in the answer to the last question, that the students, you know, can do these interactions repeatedly. They can do these interactions that they can do the types of interactions that may not even be feasible in real life. So, you know, in real life, you don't have a floating flashcard above, you know, the thing that you want to learn about. You'd have to ask somebody or, you know, Google it. But in this environment, we're able to, you know, augment the content so that they can learn right there immediately. Another thing, maybe to follow up to the previous question of it a little bit, is that with language being so social, we wanted to sort of establish a collaborative space that they could practice in. So in the environment, and to one of the questions in the previous session about like note taking and all, the whole class is in the environment. The whole class is working together, and they can help each other. So one of the examples that we notice is that when one student is struggling, another student who might know that information already can go over and they're assisting each other. And they told us that on their way out that that they worked more with each other in our space than they would have in any other of their traditional classes.
Excuse me, my chiming to answer to supplement Sam's answer.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Yeah, another benefit of the immersive learning versus the actual authentic learning material is that our learners are able to see the transcripts live on the site. So when the pronunciation is not so excellent, when the AI avatar cannot get the utterances, they know immediately maybe the pronunciation was not right. So they will be able to look up the screen on the 360 degree screens and to see what happened, where the problem is. So they will try to self-correct the pronunciation and try to say the interaction again so that they can pass the understandable pronunciation on the site. So this is one of the advantages we think is better than the traditional authentic learning materials, because in traditional learning materials, authentic materials, nobody would tell them what the errors are or why the interlocutors cannot understand the utterances. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so as we wait to see if there's any more questions coming in the chat, we just have some really good comments that I do want to point out as far as Tracy has been using it to train individuals in the hospitality sector so that they could use VR for English language learning. And Susanna says this could be done in virtual worlds though, as you could get real strangers there for practice sake. So lastly, Lillian says, thank you for sharing. So interesting. I hope I can do more about language and collaboration too. So we still have some time. So I'll patiently wait to see if there's any more questions. But in the meanwhile, I have one specific question for each presenter. So for the first one, with the Irish focus, you said in the video that I had watched and your research paper, you said that there was a lot of iterations to get to where you currently were. So I know going forward, you plan to focus on larger class sizes of the current platform, but maybe can you talk about what you have iterated on in the past and how you got to this final version right now?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I don't really go into it as much in this paper because we tried to kind of group the papers into what was found in each case study. But the overarching thesis kind of talks about this design-based research quite a lot more. And specifically what it talks about is what's really interesting in virtual environments is in each environment that you build for your users, it kind of becomes its own context in itself. So something we found interesting is whatever learning or whatever objective we found in one environment, then when we tailor and change it to another, are we still talking about the same environment? And it's very difficult, particularly to be rigorous and scientific in things we build in Unity, because any variable suddenly changes a huge dichotomy of how everything works. So we kind of our whole process for building this worked through some of the questionnaires I talked to here were the quantitative methods, and then we used a lot of qualitative methods to get feedback from learners, and we kind of used those surveys and that information to kind of build each iteration, and we talked through and described these iterations. So the iteration I'm describing here was our third iteration of the whole environment, and that's another reason they were done in quite small sample groups, because to get all this qualitative feedback that we got as well, it was important to kind of get a small group that could give us quite a detailed amount of information about how the environment went on. And that's where, when I talk about future work in terms of building it out bigger, that's when we're looking at trying to get more rigorous sample sizes and be able to see the measure this has. But I think overall in immersive environments, it leads to quite a big question about what we can say about our environments. And that's because no matter what you build, the interaction is going to be slightly differently, and that kind of changes the results of what you're saying. And particularly like if you look at the gaming environment and games people play, in most games, you know, at some point a character is shooting a gun, but the interaction that shoots that gun is very different across the thousands of games that have been made where a character shoots a gun, for example. So it's the same in our learning environments. And I don't think it's authentic for us to not chronicle and detail that in detail. And it makes it harder to draw conclusions, but also I think it's important that that design cycle is kind of integral into how we design these things. So I hope that answers the question there slightly.
Great, thank you. So to avoid jumping between presenters, we have a question in the chat for you as well. So was the present survey you used designed for evaluating immersive experiences? And how did you determine which survey to use?
So the present survey that we used was this Mel Slater survey on presence. So that he did a lot of work, and I think it was, off the top of my head, I think it's from a 1992 paper he has. And then, sorry, there's a second part to that, was there? And how did we actually determine that? That was just through our lit review. And basically, there's a lot of work done in presence, and we just felt specifically with a lot of the work ways we were agreeing and aligning, the Mel Slater version for us kind of signed up a lot. But there is a lot of work, like there's a few bigger names in VR research in particular who kind of would view presence and immersion slightly separately. So there's a lot of quite detailed responses about them. So I think it really goes to how that worldview and how the specific researchers themselves kind of align with that. I would like to add that, and even most researchers themselves would say that surveys aren't great for presence, because presence is meant to be measuring how you feel within a specific context at a specific time. And a survey only talks about how you remember yourself feeling at that current time. And there's still a lot of debate around how we actually measure that feeling of feeling in a place. So we're still kind of, there's a lot of work being done on that, but it's quite a difficult area. So we tried as much as possible. While we give a metric for it, I think it's a difficult one to be very hard about in knowing how effective it is. So I found the qualitative stuff we did in the interview stuff actually ended up giving us a lot more detailed responses and a lot truer responses rather than the quantitative numbers we ended up getting.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. So to try to balance the questions, I'm going to ask one to you, Samuel, and your team. So with your video, I know that you had some great results as far as the students' perceived interaction with other classmates, and a large majority said it was either they felt more connected to their classmates, or even higherly more connected to their classmates. So I'm going to be devil's advocate, and I know that 9.1% said they had less interaction with their classmates. Did you ask any follow-up questions as to why they felt that way? Or if not, maybe talk a little bit more about what you saw as the value of the interaction overall with classmates, and how the large majority said yes, it actually helped with interaction overall.
Sure. I'm not sure if we have a specific follow-up question for that one particular student, but I know we did keep some like interaction diaries as the students were engaging with the system. And I think the way the students normally would interact is they would go up in pairs. And I think we've found that some of the pairs were more excitedly paired together, and some of the other students were wanted to work more individually. And just as a control for the study, we kept everybody in pairs. But I think that just like with many learning styles, this learning in these spaces isn't necessarily for everybody, and some students would rather work on a more individual level. No,
that's perfect. No, that's perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so we do have some generic questions for both of you and possibly the audience. So has anyone successfully reused a virtual environment that someone else built to use for their own language community? And if you haven't, if you just go ahead and say no.
Not exactly. We have another portion of our language learning environment that I didn't talk about today is we do have a virtual world that the students can also visit, and there they can talk to avatars and do some tasks in that as well. And we did work at the very initial outset of that project. We did work with a local game development company in Unity. So we were to produce a virtual world. So there was a bit of a collaboration there with some experts in game production to get a virtual world made.
Yeah, and I suppose our research specifically was looking at using tools like Unity and things more than we currently do, because I think a lot of work at the moment is being done in tools like Second Life. And I had a background in game development itself, so it kind of allowed for kind of deeper interaction and deeper intricacies into these interactions. And I think that's what's exciting about the future of this stuff, this work, because the cost of development and the skill set needed to develop your own immersive tools and develop your own games is always reducing. Like indie games themselves and games being able to built by groups of 1 and 2 developers only started around 2009, and now it's quite a big scene. And I know that's going to evolve into the research scene and is beginning to, with characters like myself and others who come from a game development background and are able to author their own tools. So I suppose we kind of reflected it the other way in trying to author our own tools and research on them at the same time, rather than trying to augment what's already there.
Great, fantastic. So we actually have some more questions, so I will go through them one at a time. So Jack Ratcliffe says, did either of you use environmental sound? And if so, did you get any feedback about it from users?
Yes, so we spatialize the environment using the Oculus spatialization SDK. Yeah, users liked it. It's quite tricky, and I would say that my supervisor, his background and his thesis was about audio engineering, and it didn't go into the same detail as some other work in our research lab actually goes specifically into a lot of spatialization techniques. So it would have been quite a basic level of it. But at the same stage, it was something users commented on, and it was something that really helped with the immersion in the environment, just that it was at a very basic level. As users walked away from characters, there was that 3D effect of being able to hear them echo around the empty room and things like this. But yeah, I think where it was difficult, if anything, was in users talking themselves, because we couldn't use that same spatialization for the audio recordings users were talking to. So they would talk in the shop in a voice that was their own, but the shop voice was spatialized the other way. So that had a bit of a interesting thing we didn't account for beforehand. But yeah.
Yeah, and for our system, I put together a sort of a spatial audio system. It has a minimum of 8 loudspeakers that we use because the screen is 360 degrees. Originally, when the space was put together, we had just 2 stereo speakers sitting to one side, and that didn't allow us to sort of congruently present the audio and the visuals together. So we put together this system, and it's expandable, but now we can present the audio congruent with the visuals. So if there's a character or a dialogue box on the screen, the speech comes from that. We did get some feedback from the students. We added some sound effects to the interactions themselves to sort of redundantly notify the students when they've engaged with something. So if they clicked on something, there is audible information that comes out of it, so that they know what sort of interactions they've been doing. And they did find that really helpful because they were sort of, it grounded them a little bit more in the interactions that they were doing. And some of the other things that we added were, depending on the scenes that they were visiting, we paired it with some ambient tracks. So if they were in a market, there was some background noise of people and moving about. There was, if they're in, say, like a garden, we can use sort of like bird sounds and some nature sounds. So it adds to the sort of immersive qualities of the scene, say. And then another sort of audio feature, not quite environmental sounds, but we wanted the students to be able to hear the words. So if they opened up an information box or a dialog box, they were able to click on different words to get the pronunciation information out of it. And that was presented to them also congruently with the space. So it was nice if one student was working on something on one side of the room, the other student was working on something on the screen on the other side of the room. It wasn't just a master sound that was being piped into the room, it was focused right up where that student was standing.
Okay, so we do have a couple comments just from everyone as far as their own experiences with immersive and language learning. So we do have, I want to be cognizant for the next group. So we do have about 10 minutes left, so please continue to type in the questions. But I'm going to pose a challenging one. And as far as for both of you, when you were thinking about the design, I know this has come up in the past, how did you plan for and try to address accessibility as far as visually impaired learners, even colorblind users, as well as diversity and making sure that you had a diverse population when you were creating in the immersive environment?
So I'll tackle kind of some of them. So we had a lot of thoughts about this, and I think an interesting thing about accessibility and diversity is testing became really important at this thing, because a lot of things came up that obviously as one individual with my own range of my own experience, you can't do this alone, and it's where testing again becomes quite essential, because this is when these different areas kind of pop up, and it's important to kind of test varied groups. So in terms of colorblindness, Unity is great for this because they have a package directly for colorblindness. So when you input it into your project, it directly looks and changes a lot of the color schemes in your thing to be a slight. It doesn't fix these issues, and it still depends on the colors you use, but it slightly reduces some of the issues you can have with colorblindness. The same with the environment itself. So all the characters, I think in my slide you might have seen one of the characters, but I think there's about 16 characters in the shop overall, and these were balanced in terms of gender, race, age. There was a lot of kind of work around. Yeah, we can see that there. So that's probably the whitest, gingerest man in our talk, but they are balanced in terms of a lot of different groupings. One thing that only came across when we actually tried out the experience and started testing with users was 80% of our participant groups were female, but myself and my supervisors and all the people who were originally looking at the first test were all male, and we were slightly taller. So when we were going around the shop, we were able to all reach the top shelves without any issue. And it was to introduce some kinesthetic movement into the environment. We intentionally made some of the objects high so players would have to move around. But in our first trial, primarily female users weren't able to actually reach up to the top floor. So from that trial, and this again, when I kind of highlight how important it is to design for specific groups and actually design with testing these things out and how VR can impact this, we had to get a lot of different users in, and particularly of different height sizes, so they were able to engage with the whole task and to ensure for accessibility. And that's where VR accessibility, even things like height, can suddenly become important that mightn't be in another status. But there's a huge other range of accessibility options that we didn't even get time to look into, and you know, a lot of work is being done by others in these kind of areas.
Great. And for our space, because it's such a multimodal interaction, there is the visual and the audio, and there's also the gesture. So students are able to speak and hear almost every interaction, and they're also able to click and select on every interaction. But we've also got, for students who might not have, say, like the dexterity to do gestures, there is also a tracking system in the ceiling of the room that will track spatial positions. So if a student, say in a wheelchair, moves up to one portion of the screen, it can activate content on the screen as they approach it, rather than having to click on it from another part of the room. And as a sort of another project that we've touched on in the space, we've had a local artist, David Whalen, who is a paraplegic, come in, and he has a controller for his laptop that allows him to control his computer with his lip. And he's actually created beautiful art pieces that we've been able to display in our immersive environments. And then related to that, we've worked with them and also with the creators of the Jaimie app. It's the adaptive use musical instruments. So for students who might not have the dexterity or the ability to play a traditional instrument, these use like an iPad app, and they can use motion to control different instruments that way. And we've been able to hook that up to our spatial audio system there and sort of have a little concert with users of this app. So it's something we've discussed and always needs a little bit more contributed to it, absolutely.
Okay, so great. We have two more questions, so we'll do them one by one. So the first is, one of the common concerns that some researchers have, not my case, around the use of these technologies for learning is the amount of space needed to deploy these experiences. What are your thoughts on this?
So I think that's kind of changing with the environment all the time. I think VR is interesting because I started this project 3 years ago now, and we were using completely different headsets. And that headset, again, has now evolved into probably the Oculus Quest is the most freely used headset we'd have at the moment. So that space is always reducing. And I think there's a lot of companies particularly looking at this issue because that issue of space is a slight issue still, but it's less and less becoming an issue as we, for example, using headsets now that don't need tracking systems around the room, and these kind of issues are being tackled, and even the way we can map out areas is improving constantly. So I'd say it is a question. I think like the space Oculus Quest has left us has nearly solved the problem entirely. And as well, the only thing I'd highlight about it is if we are to look at contextual use of learning and the real advantages that come with VR, it does come with a space requirement, but it also, we have to ask ourselves what we're gaining out of using that extra space. So I would argue that yes, I wouldn't highlight it fully as a limitation, but more look at it as that's how this kinesthetic approach of being able to walk around is being able to be utilized. So we do need obviously space to move around, and we wouldn't call that a limitation of a PE class, for example. So I don't specifically think it necessarily needs to be a limitation of VR use either.
Yeah, and to our system, we use a front projection system, so there's almost no negative space behind the screen. And so that limits the footprint a little bit from a more like back projection cave type system. But we are actually considering how something like this might be sized for more like a high school application or at another university. And we do foresee that some of these rooms can be done at a little bit smaller scale than the one that we've got. But we also think that as going forward, as this VR and AR paradigm kind of shifts more into the classroom, these types of spaces will be possibly architecturally built into spaces as they're being made. So could we say drop down projection screens around a room and create an environment in a space that already exists? Or like if there's a space in a high school like a band hall that's already acoustically treated, it's ready for a space like this, could we have a sort of drop deployable system that would, you'd be able to create within a half an hour or so, so that if a teacher or a professor wanted to use the space for half of a day, they could do so for like a workshop or something. So absolutely, yeah, some of these, the footprint of some of these spaces is could be quite large, but we think that if we can build them into existing spaces or make use of existing spaces already, that will sort of assuage that concern.
I think it's really interesting that about the example of one that can come down from a band room setup and then retract, of course. So a follow-up is from Jaimie, similar to the previous question. What would you say is currently the main limitation of technology as it pertains to language learning in the context of immersive systems?
Sorry.
You can go, or I'll go, okay. I think one of the limitations that we see right now is content and being able to create as much content that is needed by the professors as possible. And that was actually one of the motivations for this project. With the virtual world experience that we have, it's been in development for years, and it is a rich experience, but it's really difficult to add content or change content right on the fly. And there are only a certain amount of scenes that can be created in a given time. So again, for the motivation of this project is that these scenes can be created in a few hours, and we can work with the professor to, if she would like to see a scene on a specific thing, we can build that in a given day. And then additionally, something like Unity is a little harder to alter fly, but with these scenes, we can go in and make tweaks to the back end. Say if the professor wants to add, hey, there's this really interesting thing here that students have been asking about. Can you tag that with a vocabulary thing? And we can do that immediately while the class is happening. So the next students that go up and do some discovery, they'll have that information available. So definitely content creation and sort of a possible standard for doing that, so we can all share that information.
And yeah, just to add into that as well. Oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the big challenges we had, one of the motivations we had was when I talk about in a minority language context, is you have a lot less technology. So the English language would have where primarily a lot of these tools are being built. But for example, in Irish, we wouldn't have that same level of ability to get feedback from the system. So we wouldn't have tools, say, like, sorry, the name I'm missing. We wouldn't have tools for speech recognition. So this really limited us in this project in that items are asked for and characters pick them up and they can hear what the item sound is. But currently in the system, you can't actually engage and talk to the avatars because the avatars have no way of picking up the feedback of your system and picking up the language of what you're saying. And as I was saying before, what we were interested in is giving more reason and more rationality and more tools for people to engage in using Irish. And this is the same across most minority languages. There's very little use, and that's where we think technology can add a huge advantage. But our main limitation is there's not enough technology engaging in that use, and we're quite limited from a minority viewpoint of needing more people to build these tools. So we start building better tools, and there's more use for that, and it's a bit cyclical that way, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. So we are about 5 minutes before the hour. And so again, I do want to make some time so you could go to the next session. But I wanted to wrap up with one final question. And I know that both of you really talked greatly about the next steps. But if you want to kind of recap what your next steps are, or if you have any additional projects on your horizon, please feel free to mention those before we wrap things up.
So yeah, I suppose next steps we're looking at now after this is I'm starting to come towards the end of my thesis. So that's my next step at the moment. But we're also looking in terms of this project, we're looking to start looking at things like classroom usage and how we could roll this out in a bigger way, and starting to look at other minority languages and start partnerships with other areas to try and see how that would evolve the project and see if the context would have a huge shaping on how these tools would be used differently. And as I just explained there, it'd be great to get some feedback systems involved and multiplayer and other areas like this we're very engaged with using next.
Yeah, and the future direction right now of part of our system is to move some of this content to a more online platform so that students, while they're away from campus right now, can still access and learn with it. And doing that, we're able to, we'll add in some more features as well that might not be available in our immersive space. So we're working on some additional mini games and everything that the students can work with. One of the other students that I work with is building what he's calling tone trainers. So the students can listen to a native speaker speak the word, and then they can practice as well. And the system will show them the differences between how they spoke the word and how a native speaker would speak the word. And they're given a graph, and then they're able to compare the two to make their differences. So incorporating some of these new tools. We've started working on using AI in some of these mini games. One of the things that we do have in the image here, you can see, if I can move it back to my slide. The student here is actually playing an I Spy game that the system created. So the system used an object detection model to scan the image and see what content is there, and then it prompted the student and said, "Hey, I see this bicycle. Can you find it?" So incorporating more of these AI elements to maybe help track the users, their progress, and help with progressing the students, being able to point them to the resources that might help them depending on what how they've been progressing. So.
Fantastic. So I want to thank you both again for a wonderful session, and everyone for participating and asking some great questions for our presenters. So to wrap things up, I would like for us to give a round of applause. So go ahead and press F4 and thank our presenters for today. So thank you all and have a great day.